All right, we are recording. Thank you all for attending and participating in our first Friday's Lunch and Learn. This one is regarding achieving equity through culturally relevant assessments, presented by Katie Surber from Wake Tech. Katie, take it away.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. If you were able to participate in the icebreaker, that is wonderful. If not, you can continue to do so, or at least get started thinking about, as Emily presented the question, and as we get started, what type of assessments do you currently use in your course? And when you plan for your course material and you begin to plan for your assessments, what role do diversity and equity play in this assessment planning? Sorry. So today we are going to, with that in mind, really talk about four main, sorry guys. Let me go back. 4 main ideas. We're going to first talk about what we mean when we talk about equity in the classroom. And then we're going to talk about how we currently assess our students and revisit that old way of assessing and why it's important for us to revisit that old way, what culturally relevant teaching says about assessment, and then the majority of our time, how we can create assessments that work for our students using culturally relevant teaching. So let's go ahead and get started with the first goal, which is what is equity in education? So when we begin to define equity in education, it's important anytime that we talk about assessments, anytime that we talk about culturally relevant teaching, that we start first by defining what we mean by equality and what we mean by equity. We want to have the basis of these definitions in our course planning. So when we talk about equality, we are talking about the idea that we are developing courses that we are treating each student equal in the classroom. And what we mean by that is that every student is given the same opportunity. So every student is given the same access to the materials. Every student is given the same type of learning outcomes. Every student is given the same opportunity to learn, and then the same type of assessment in the course. And I would say pretty confidently that when we sit here in these sessions and we work with other educators, that we feel comfortable with the idea that we are achieving equality in our classroom. We are treating students the same when they come into our course. Every student is given the same opportunity to learn successfully in our courses. When we talk about equity, though, what we're talking about is the idea that we are considering how this individual students learn and the individual students' road to get to that classroom. Oftentimes, equality and equity in these conversations get used the same way, and they're really not. Equality is for the group, and equity really focuses on the individual. So they do go hand in hand, they are equally important, but when it comes to course planning, we have to also consider each individual student that comes into our class. And we have to think about what opportunities has that student had before coming into the class, what barriers may that student be facing as they come into the classroom, both academically and non-academically, and how can we plan for those barriers in order to achieve equality. For instance, we may feel comfortable with the idea that, well, every student here in this course, I assess the same way, and every student is given the same opportunity. They have a due date, they have the material, they have access to Blackboard or whichever learning management system you have. So every student is set up to be successful on that test. But what we may not take into account is the idea that a student perhaps does not have reliable internet at home, or a student may not learn the same way with the course material. So if we're only offering multiple choice tests for that particular student, they're not able to demonstrate their learning the best way for them. So how this relates to diversity, it relates to diversity because we need to be sure that we are representing all of our students that come into the classroom, and not just culturally representing them, which is of course part of diversity planning, but also that we are planning for how they learn differently in that classroom. And if we want to give our students the opportunity to be successful, and if we want to retain our students in the class, and we want to give our students a sense of belonging in the class, then we have to be sure that we are thinking about what is best for our students. What is the best way for them to demonstrate their understanding? What is the best way for them to make connections to the course material? What is the best way for them to understand that what they are learning is relevant to them and relevant to their community? So this relates to the assessments we create, because oftentimes in education and in course planning, we fall into this education fallacy, which it's the three musketeer fallacy, this idea that what is good for one is good for all. And that falls back to that difference of equality and equity. So when we think about our assessments in our course, oftentimes we are thinking about, here's our course outcomes, here's how I present my material, and then here's how I assess my students. And I think if we start thinking about our courses and thinking about where are our students most successful, where do we find that students start to fall behind, where do our students start to get frustrated, if we pinpoint it to our assessments, many times it has to do with students are not being given the opportunity to really not just make connections, but express their understanding to us with the course material. One of the things that's been interesting to see in education is the idea that we have long accepted this idea for probably many, well, I guess for me, I've reached the point in my age and in my experience for many decades now, that we have accepted the idea that this multiple ways of learning. We have accepted that our students may come into the classroom and learn differently. And many people have made accommodations for this in the classroom. And what I mean by that is, when you build an online course now, most people know that they build it and they might put something in there for students to read. And then they put something in there for students to listen to. And then they, of course, include videos now. So they give students different opportunities to learn the material. But we haven't really transitioned to this idea comfortably yet, of the idea that it's not just multiple ways of learning, but it should also be multiple ways and multiple opportunities to demonstrate. We have, even though built courses where they're creative and they're engaging content, and students are again given this opportunity to read and then listen and then watch, we still ask them to show their understanding in a very specific way. When it comes time to do the assessment part of the course, then what you should be asking yourself as we continue to talk about this topic is, what is the purpose for this specific assessment that you are offering your students? Do you want them to prove knowledge to you, or do you want them to improve in your course? And what I mean by that is, many times when we put an assessment up, it's a benchmark in our course. We feel that they have read through this material, and now we need to check their understanding. They need to prove to me that they have read the material, or they need to prove to me that they understand the formula, or they need to prove to me that they are grasping the core concepts. And of course, we're not tossing that away. We have to be able to assess our students in a way that we can monitor their understanding. But what we also want to include is we want to ask ourselves, okay, well, what's my next step? How can I then improve it? If I'm gathering all this good information on my students and I'm testing their knowledge and I'm looking and making sure that they are understanding the course, what comes next? What am I asking them to then do with this information? How can I improve what they are learning in this course? So what is culturally relevant teaching? And I'm not going to spend too much on this topic. Well, I'm going to introduce this topic. It's a huge topic if you've gone to other sessions on culturally relevant teaching. So it's not the main focus of today. We're going to, of course, focus on the assessment portion of it, but it is important to just talk about it briefly to understand where the assessment portion plays into the big overall branch of culturally relevant teaching. So if you're familiar with culturally relevant teaching, or if you're not, the brief background of it is that it is a pedagogy that was originally developed in the mid-90s by Gloria Ladson-Billings. And in her research, what her goal was to identify teaching strategies that she saw led to success in the classroom. So she went into the classroom and she observed different teachers. And ultimately what she found was there were very specific teaching qualities that these teachers had. And through that, she developed what became known as culturally relevant teaching. It has gone through some, you might see culturally relevant pedagogy now, culturally responsive pedagogy. It has continued to evolve since its original theory development in the 90s. But what it has shown us is when practiced, it does have success in the classroom. In her writing of her original publication, where she defined culturally relevant teaching, what Ladson-Billings first emphasized was the idea that students, to be successful in the classroom, students should see themselves reflected in the course material. So the classroom should become a place where students, of course, see their culture in the classroom, and not just see their culture, but they're encouraged to share their culture. They're encouraged to learn about each other's culture. So there was an emphasis on the idea of mirrors and windows. Mirrors, the opportunity to see yourself reflected in the course, and then windows, the opportunity to look into other people's cultures and world viewpoints and beliefs. So there's this encouragement that this is a place where you can share and develop your sense of identity. To do that, what Ladson-Billings really developed were three main tenets that she felt should be emphasized in the classroom. The first one was academic achievement. And what she meant by academic achievement was that she found that educators need to hold their students to high academic standards. There has to be this, when students come into the classroom, there needs to be a level of high expectations that should be met. Now, I know whenever I talk about that one, I think our instinct as educators is to say, well, I'm already doing that. Like, I have high expectations in the classroom. So what the conversation then becomes is, how then do we make sure that our students are reaching those high expectations? Some of the things that were emphasized in the first tenet of culturally relevant teaching were things like making sure that you are creating a student-centered classroom. So your students are giving more responsibility in the classroom. You are creating a course built around your students, making sure that your students understand the outcomes, that they are SMART goals, that your students are setting SMART goals for themselves, that those goals are continually referenced. So anytime they do an assignment, anytime they do an assessment, you bring it right back to, this is why you are doing this. This is how you are being measured, that there's a strong rubric in place, and that your students are really seeing the relevance of each assignment that they do, that they are able to understand the expectations and then understand how it's building on the previous assignment, the next assignment. And we're going to talk more specifically as we get into how to create assessments that reach these tenets. So I don't want anyone to feel like this is the only time you're ever going to hear about any of this. We're going to continue to talk about this, but I wanted to give a broad overview before we dived a little bit deeper into these. The second thing that Lansing-Billings really emphasized was the idea that culturally relevant teaching should emphasize cultural competence. So students, as I said, should see themselves reflected in the course material. And that reflection should be a part of the class conversation. They should be encouraged to share. They should be encouraged to bring up not their own personal stories. They should be encouraged to share their values. And then more importantly, as they begin to do so, the material begins to take shape on that conversation. So once a student begins to share, well, this is what my family has always done, then that conversation continues and you ask them to share more. And then if, for example, I teach American literature, well, then the next course I may bring in, hey, last class we were talking about this student A shared this about his family. Let's look at this short story that is, and then read it together. Let's have a conversation. Let's go back to what you were sharing. Anyone else want to share experiences where they have also had a similar idea, similar viewpoint, or similar thing that your family does? We want them to feel as if they can really begin to feel proud. That was one of the things that Lansing-Billings emphasized, was that students in the classroom should be proud of their identity and want to continue to share more about themselves. And then the last tenet was the idea that the classroom should lead to greater social awareness. So the course material should be relevant to the course, of course, relevant to the main goal of your department and your institution, but also the student should understand that they are a member of a community, that they are going to go outside the classroom and they're going to contribute to society. So how does what they are learning in this course help them once they go out into their career, and then help them socially become aware of what is happening in their community? And a lot of times where this can be emphasized is in the assessments that you're using. And the idea of asking them to take a more active role in understanding what is happening locally, what is happening at the college, to explore more about the community that they are currently a part of. This particular visual was one that I came across in my research that I thought was just a really helpful way to see how, when you create your assessments, what you should be considering as you develop them, and how this creation of assessments would support students when you're using culturally relevant teaching. So some of the things to consider as you begin to think about what type of assessments you currently have, and then brainstorm how you can build on those assessments. The first thing that we want to think about is, how engaging are your current assessments? So do you ask students in your current assessments to share their voice? Do you give them agency over how they are demonstrating their learning? And we're going to continue to talk more about all of this, but these are just some things to start further thinking about. So do you ask them, do you empower them in their choice? That's part of culturally relevant teaching, was the idea of that student-centered classroom. So are you giving students an opportunity to have that agency in their demonstration? In that engagement, is the process something, the final product, something that is meaningful to the student? So when the student is given the opportunity to engage with the assessment and given the opportunity to choose how he, she, or they is going to demonstrate their learning, then it becomes more meaningful to them because they feel more invested in that product. For example, on a choice board where a student is given, you can choose one of the following ways to demonstrate your understanding. I had a student in the past that wanted to, he always chose a computer animation of some kind because that was his major at the school. He got so invested and had so much fun creating games for the class or creating videos, things that I never would have assigned as an English instructor, but they were some of the coolest things that I had gotten in the classroom. So, and he was excited to share them because this was something he genuinely loved to do. And he fulfilled my requirements. He fulfilled the outcomes. He demonstrated his understanding, and they were enjoyable to share and enjoyable to watch. Are you encouraging a cultural identity with your students? So are you asking your students, when you design your assessments, are you asking them to draw on their own social and cultural backgrounds? A really good opportunity to do that is in your discussion boards, which is many people in their online learning, discussion boards is how they monitor their weekly understanding. So when you create your discussion boards, are you making sure that you are including questions that encourage students to share their personal experiences? Are your questions just textbook related, or are they more geared towards, have you ever experienced this? Can you share a time? And then you can gather that information from your students, and then you can really have good conversations based on their social and cultural backgrounds. Do you incorporate collaboration into the assessment experience? Now, we all know how much students love collaboration and how much we love to assign it. But it is an important part of culturally relevant teaching if we want our students to have that opportunity for the windows part of it. If we want them to learn about each other and be challenged and raise their social consciousness, then we have to give them the opportunity to work together. So even if it's a low stakes opportunity, things like study guide, creating a study guide together, if it's matching people up in pairs and discussions instead of having one big discussion. But we want to incorporate a collaboration into that assessment experience so they're really feeling more comfortable sharing with each other. Are you considering the vulnerability aspect of it? So what that means is, are you looking at your assessment as a way to motivate your students in their understanding without intimidating them? For many students at the community college, as we know in our student population, the fear of the classroom is a big trigger for our students. We deal a lot with non-traditional first-generation college students, and historically, research has shown that fear of the classroom is what prevents one of the reasons our students may not be successful. And fear to approach, fear of that they won't be successful, fear that they are not good enough, that they are not at the level that they should be. So if they only are given assessments where it's grade, 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 and not a process throughout, then that idea is just going to continually be given to them and emphasized to them. There was research done in the 2000s. Deborah Cox published a book on the fear factor of students in community college. And that is one of the things that she continually found, that students who are not submitting their assignments or are not doing it, not because they didn't complete the assignment, but because they are fearful of the grade that they're going to get. So there are students in the classroom that are doing the work that are just not submitting it because they're too scared to see what it could be. So we have to give our students opportunity to demonstrate their understanding without being scared to do so. Are your assignments, do you encourage your students to draw on their own strengths. So it goes back to the example that I shared about giving them the opportunity to demonstrate. So do you give them tools, strengths to demonstrate what they know and can do? So are you encouraging to them to think outside that box, to develop their critical thinking skills in a way that they can draw upon what they already know, in a way that they can, be creative and have fun? And then, are you also asking your students to demonstrate a higher order of thinking and cross-content connections? When you create your assessments, is it just one particular type of assessment every single time? So is it always a test? Is it always a quiz? Is it always a discussion board? Is there a way that you can ask your students to demonstrate that thinking in a higher order level than just memorizing and reciting, memorizing and reciting? So I guess we don't have to necessarily answer this question here, but before we start to talk about the assessments, I'll pause for a second just to see if anyone has any initial questions about the first part of the conversation.
We don't see any questions posted in the chat, but everyone does have the opportunity if they just want to use their microphone and ask.
Awesome. So we will then now talk about, now that we've given the background on the importance of planning for assessments, and while the old way wasn't always working, what then should you be doing when you begin to plan for your assessments? So when you begin to plan for your assessments, some of the things that you should start to focus on. First of all, you want to think about how you can increase the engagement of your assessment planning. So how can you give more ownership to your students in the type of assessments that you are offering to them? This comes back to the idea of student choice in the assessments. And I do recognize that sometimes student choice, and I'm going to give a sample about what student choice would look like, but sometimes student choice can sound a little bit intimidating, the idea of giving students the option of how they're going, what type of assignment they're going to do, but it's not completely on your own, hey, come up with something. You still have control over it, but it's giving your students ownership of, this is how I would be comfortable demonstrating my understanding to you. You want to increase the rigor of your assessments. So you want to give assessments to your students where there are multiple solutions. This is things, for example, like more case studies in your course, asking your students to apply the material by real life application, where there is not, each of us might have a different way that we would approach it, but as long as I can defend my way and make it relevant to what we have learned in the course, so I can defend it through course material, then I should be good. So I'm offering multiple solutions in your assessments too. Provide your students with a space that they can share stories. So discussion boards are always good ones, but also things like weekly journals, muddiest points, asking your students to share with you how things have been going, surveys in your course. So we always recognizing that on our end, and it's okay to think about to think about this too in our course planning. We already have a lot of students in the class. So sometimes we do have to think about, well, how much more can I grade for one class? That's a very fair question. So things like short surveys are a quick way to monitor your students and then also ask them to share stories with you. One of the things that I started to include in my course that I really liked was the idea, the muddiest point at the end of every week. So it asked my students, what was one thing that was unclear to you? So I could monitor their learning. I was able to still engage with them every week. They were telling me how their week was going. And then I could see, okay, so many students said that this was difficult. I'm going to start the new week by re-explaining this concept to them. And really encourage them to share personal community stories, and also in your course planning, include personal community stories. So when you create your assessments, whenever possible, if there's something locally at the college or in your community that is happening that's relevant to your course, use that as your example instead of just your textbook example. Show them that this is something that the conversation has taken place locally in our community too. So how could you contribute to this conversation? Or how would you contribute? If this were something that was happening here at the college, how would you then approach it? You also want to think about how you can begin to add more collaborative assessments. First, just planning assessments collaboratively with your students. So again, that core concept of having a student engaged or a student-centered classroom. That could be things like a multiple means of engagement. It could also mean things like your students can pitch projects to you. So you can ask the students for your final piece in this course is we have this sort of project, a business simulation, for example. Well, what sort of project would you want to work on to demonstrate your understanding of this core concept? Looking at the rubrics, rubrics are an important part of holding your students to high expectations. So you not only should have full, complete rubrics, but this is also an opportunity to make your students a part of the collaborative process of planning your assessments too. So when you assign an assessment to your students, taking the time to create or have them participate in a rubric creation with you. So talking to your students and saying, what do you think are the main parts of this assignment that are relevant to the course material? Asking them to make the connections of the importance of this assignment. So really having a conversation with your students when you have an assignment is a part of, when you look back at culturally relevant teaching, that first tenet of academic achievement. That tenet is really focusing on the idea that your students understand the expectations and that they understand the value of the class time. So having the conversation when you have an assignment, that the instructions are clear, that what you expect from them are clear. But then asking your students to also, well, what do you think should be a criteria of this evaluation? What are you looking for? And taking that into consideration as part of your conversation. I mentioned that Deborah Cox book, the Fear of the in the Classroom one, and that was one of the things when she talked to the community college students, that what they found to be good teachers was that they really understood what was being asked of them on every single assignment, and that it was really talked about in the classroom. So giving them that opportunity to also collaborate together on what would be the main outcomes that you would look for is making them also a part of this collaborative assessment planning. In your course planning, one of the ways that you can look at assessments is the importance of also adding early assessments to your course. So the early assessments are really there as some low stake ideas to get your students comfortable with the course, for you to get to know your students, and then can influence your course planning throughout your weekly lessons too. So early assessments are an important part of the course, but then also an important part of the lessons too. So if you have not yet thought about ways to include pre-surveys before your lessons to prepare your students for the week or to prepare you for what their needs are going to be, This is a really good way to get your students involved in assessments. One of the good opportunities in your learning management system, it would be to include a pre-assessment survey at the beginning of a lesson. What do you already know about this? Name one thing. Being a very specific question so that your students can start thinking, this is something I already know, or gosh, I really can't think of an answer to this question. We want to ask a very specific question, not how much do you already know about this? Because if we ask how much, students will say, I'm okay. We want them to name something. That way they have to really think about the question. This is a good way for you then to collect that information to see, okay, well, some of my students will understand what's going to happen this week. Some of my students have never heard of this concept before, so I may need to end up slowing down a little bit. And then for some of my students, there's going to be more instructional need as I get through this lesson, because they have claimed to be familiar, but as they move through the lesson, I'm seeing that there's a gap in what they thought they knew and what I'm presenting. You can also look at surveys, not just assessments of course material, but as a way to get to know your students during that orientation time. So when we talked about the difference of equity and equity taking into account the individual student's needs. So thinking about some of the equity concerns of your students, asking them during orientation is a good way to start to plan for the assessments in your course. So asking them questions about how they learn best, about things like where do you work on your assignments at home? How do you work on your assignments at home? Where do you prefer to test? Do you work in a quiet place? Just gathering some information from your students. So then as you approach testing time, if you know that you have a student that has difficulty testing at home, you have a way to reach out to that student beforehand and say, hey, we do have a test coming up in this class. I know that you expressed concern that you don't necessarily have a quiet place to test at home. Can I help you with that? So you can reach out and try to help your students be ready for these assessments in your course too. We also want to, in your course planning, think about ways that you can increase the formative assessments in your course materials. So you don't want to wait just at the end of a lesson to assess your students. You want to give your students opportunity to demonstrate their learning throughout, and you also want to check your students' understanding too. That way, if you're finding they're falling behind, or if they are not understanding a core concept, you can catch it there in the middle of a module as opposed to the end of one. It's also a good opportunity when you're thinking about culturally relevant teaching and equity needs to also look at, well, what non-academic needs are my students facing as well? So you can do a wellness check with your students too. So some examples of ways to use formative assessments in the classroom. Exit tickets, and these are things that, by the way, that I've seen faculty do in their course, so I've seen it work. Exit tickets are things that have you completed the following? What is one question that you have? You always want to word it that they have to give an answer, not a yes or no. So what is something? A weekly journal, a Flipgrid discussion. So I do a weekly Flipgrid in my class in place. So it's a weekly journal, but I do it in Flipgrid so that I ask them to respond. I kind of combine a few things. I do the muddiest point into a journal and with a Flipgrid so that they are responding in a video format. So it makes my grading a little bit easier on me because I'm listening. It's giving me a chance to multitask a little bit. And then I can reply in video format back to the student. I just find it to be a little bit faster for me. But not everyone prefers to do the video feedback to students. So a weekly journal in Blackboard can also work. I think a sticky point or sticky notes, things, I put Notely as mine, but I've seen other tech used in Blackboard or used in your LMS too, where students have to leave a sticky note of one thing that went well or one thing that they're still working on, or even more specifically, answer a question that you've presented to them, or something like a weekly summary report where maybe you give them 2 questions to answer about the course material, and then it counts more of a completion grade, but at least you can see that they're able to answer this question about the course material, or they're not able to answer the question. But increasing those formative assessments, they allow us to be more proactive in our students' learning and understanding, but it also gives our students that opportunity to also see, oh, I'm really struggling this week, and I'm struggling because either I'm struggling because I'm not understanding the course material, I'm struggling because sometimes they're just being lazy for the week, or maybe they're struggling because they've had a lot of personal issues that they're trying to balance. And actually having to write that down gives them that doors now open that they could come talk to you, and really, because a lot of times what we see is students do not disclose to us what is happening, and it's a guessing game for us when a student's not there. So it's giving them that opportunity to talk to you about what may be some of those non-academic equity barriers that they're facing too. You also want to think about the last 2 tenets of culturally relevant teaching, which were the cultural competence and the social engagement. What those really rely on are the idea that you are creating authentic assessments for your students. When we talk about authentic assessments, we mean that we are asking your students to participate in assessments that are real life application and active learning application assessments. And then whenever possible, that they are there to increase their social and civil engagements too. So things like case studies are a great way to include active learning, to include great discussions, to ask your students to really critically think about the material, to apply the material, to have to do an argumentative stance, and then to have a conversation with each other. So that really is a strong way to increase the social and civil engagement in a discussion forum, in a paper, in a test, in a video discussion if you're going to offer video. Any sort of case study is a great starting point for an authentic assessment. If you could get a local issue, it's even better, but sometimes that's challenging. So you might end up having to look more for something relevant and current in your field of study, but that's a good starting point. A problem and solution application is another great authentic assessment. So rather than just solving problems on the test, giving them a real hypothetical where they have to think about this and then solve it. And whenever possible, inserting the idea of sharing their experience or looking at other person's cultures and thinking about what they would do if they were faced with this. For example, I recently was working with the department here at Wake Tech. There was some nursing instructors that were taking my series on culturally relevant teaching, and simulations is of course a huge part of the nursing field, nursing study, and they want to rewrite their questions to also contain more culturally aware problems. What would you do if a patient came to you that was a Buddhist? So more real life application in the types of questions that you are asking your students. Asking them to perform tasks for you. One that works really well for this one is having your students keep a portfolio. And the portfolio is a collection of their work that they can follow this task list throughout the course. And then they are keeping track of their work. They are revising it, hopefully, that they are applying feedback. And so they have these smaller assessments throughout, these smaller assignments on the portfolio. And then they have a full collection of their work that they can then submit to you. Interviews, debates, discussions, peer reviews, these are all examples of authentic assessments. We just want to be sure that when we are writing our discussions, that we are asking them to real world viewpoints or share their cultural viewpoints. When we do peer reviews, that we are giving them questions that they have to answer and explaining. It really comes back to that we're really explaining to our students why this particular assignment is important to them and important to the class. We also want to provide more opportunities for our students. So a choice board, a portfolio is another good opportunity. Tic-tac-toe is very much like a choice board. Where it is a little bit different is, as it sounds, you're telling them that they have to complete 3 of 1 in whatever tic-tac-toe order they would follow. Whereas in a choice board, they could really just pick what it is that they would like to work on. And then any sort of collaborative projects in the class. So any way that we can partner up our students is a good opportunity for them. So this is an example of a choice board. This is one from an art history course, but you could see that how this person created it was they kept into account different learning styles, but they asked them to do things like write a presentation. They had to do a collaborative piece if they wanted to. They had to, this one, there was a Photoshop option, a comparison and contrast. So the overall objective stays the same, but they're given the opportunity to decide, okay, I would rather write a poem or a song or research this period than work with a partner on this one. So they're given that chance to decide, this is what I'd rather do for this. The last component is with the assessments is to think about your feedback that you are giving your students. You want to be sure when it comes to the assessments that you are, as most research has called it, the warm demander. So you are telling your students that this is what is required of you, but you are encouraging them what they have done well and then what they could do better. So rather than saying, this is where you went wrong, you want them to, here's the information that you need. Now you can correct this. You want them to really, you want to show in your feedback that it's individualized, that you are pushing them towards success because you care for their success. But what research has continually shown us too about the classroom and success in the classroom is the personalized feedback is what our students want. So they want to understand what they did wrong. They want to understand how they can improve. And then they want to see that you are invested in that improvement. So being sure that you are showing them how they can improve in that feedback is an important part of it too. With that feedback, you can also give your students an opportunity to do some self-evaluation. So when we talk about self-evaluation, we want to give our students time to also self-reflect. So things like, how did this week go? So going back to those Muddy's points and back to those journals, back to those surveys, but also when they complete an assignment and they receive their grades, looking back on it, how did you do? How could you do better? What is your plan for the next assignment? Collecting that targeted feedback from your students and reflecting on what they have shared and adjusting what your goals are is another important part of culturally relevant teaching. But we also really want to encourage our students to spend time evaluating and spend time self-reflecting on the material and on their own assessments and understanding as well. So I will stop there and just ask if there was any questions at all about anything that was talked about today. Well, if you have questions after the session, my contact information is here. I'm more than happy to answer any individualized questions, or if you wanted me to take a look at anything as you work on it, I'm happy to do that too. Anytime. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, so I'm definitely always up for conversations too. Oh, Emily, can you address those ones? Will the recording be available? And
yes, absolutely. So basically what we do after our first Friday's meetings is I will go through and take the recording and basically get them posted to our YouTube channel. Hopefully I will be able to get this one posted today. If not, probably early next week. And let me actually go to our YouTube channel and I can grab the link and put it in the chat for each of you. And of course, you can take a look at our channel and find previous sessions as well. So you should see it popping up in the chat. And also, I will say first, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Katie, for presenting. We do have one more scheduled session, which will take place the first Friday in December. And the title of that one is How Equitable Communication in the Classroom Impacts Retention. And that one is with Stacy Reagan from Caldwell with a representative from Pronto. And they'll be talking about how they use Pronto. It's integrated in the LMS, the chat tool, to communicate and engage with their students and help their faculty as well. So with that, thank you all. And unless anyone else has any questions, everyone enjoy your weekend.